You know what I really don't like?
What?
How Denmark is where it is.
Okay, with that being said, hello everybody, and welcome back to this episode of Idiot Soup. We have another very special guest on the show today. If you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hey, I'm Akib Zakaria. There we go. Done.
Oh my god, he's the worst. Okay.
What's the problem?
And Akib is joining us on today's show because he's very interested in
China.
China. He's very interested in China. He has special inclination towards China. So, if you haven't guessed it, that's what we're going to be talking about today, is China.
And a little bit of Russia.
And quite a substantial bit of Russia. And the reason being is that there's a lot going on in the international stage right now, especially with China. Today is November 19th, and yesterday, November 8th, Donald Trump basically came out and he said that the trade deal that he'd been working on with China is actually not going to happen. That was their phase one trade deal. It had something to do with tariffs, but like anything that happens within the Trump presidency, everyone on the staff had conflicting views as to what it would actually entail. So there were people saying that there would be no removal of tariffs. There were people saying that there would be a complete removal of tariffs. It was just basically a shit show. But that being said, there is no trade deal with China currently going to be settled on, which means a lot for the relationship between the United States and China, and also the relationship between Russia and China, and what that means for later. But I know that Akib has a lot of thoughts about China, so if you just want to hit on those.
I mean, I think the most important misconception with this entire trade deal is that the main focus shouldn't be the relationship between the United States and China as trading partners, but rather with the United States and China in respect to other countries in Asia and Europe and South China Sea and the Indian Ocean and those regions in general, because that's where the most of the conflict tends to be, not necessarily in between direct trade with the United States and China. And by that I mean, I know a lot of people are worried about China's what's the word for it? I guess theft of American intellectual property and just general security threats in regards to China, but I think the most egregious errors and most egregious violations of international law and I guess general ethics in terms of America's foreign policy is within respect to those nations in Europe and Asia and the South Pacific.
I mean, but
Like the South China Sea.
South China, yeah. But do you think that like America even has, not to say the heart, but like the will to go after China in regards to their violations onto other countries? Because the entire reason we even took China to the table and even began looking into tariffs and everything is this like Section 301 investigation that specifically relates to theft of intellectual property, because I mean that's what people in the United States care about, is they care about their businesses, they care about their jobs, and that's the main issue that they have with China is this theft of intellectual property. So I mean, if we can barely bring Americans to care about what's going on in China when that's going on, how are we going to bring Americans to care about China when it's not even about America?
Well, I think that's one of the like bigger misconceptions about this whole international debate is that China's influence and presence in those regions directly affects Americans. They just don't necessarily realize it because it's indirect, but a lot of the trade and a lot of jobs that occur in America happen because of the trade that we do with those regions that China is currently infiltrating. And clearly America has, or at least had an interest in this region with we're a cornerstone of the TPP before we left it, and we've had numerous trade deals with that region before we left it because with the election of Trump, because he's pursuing a more isolationist foreign policy, which I disagree with.
You want to elaborate on that?
I mean, yeah, I'll get to that, but I think it's far more reaching, especially in a world today where everything's pretty much interconnected and pretty much every product you have was probably made somewhere else outside the United States, or at least in some shape or form was affected by some other country. And that directly impacts a lot of Americans today. They just don't realize it.
Yeah, so like you said, Trump is trying to steer, he has this America First motto, and that he's trying to steer America off, or wean America off of dependency on other foreign countries, which has led to these tariffs and he's trying to decrease the trade deficit. However, we've seen that in the past years that Trump has been serving as president, the trade deficit has actually increased from 300-something billion to 400-something billion. So even his efforts to decrease his trade deficit between America and China hasn't really worked. But that being said, I now want to bring Russia into the picture. So, like you were saying, there's this isolationist policy that's kind of creating a gap between the United States and China. And the question is, like, what does that mean for the relationship between Russia and China? Because now that America isn't as big a player in that region, are China and Russia going to turn to each other? Like, President Xi Jinping has made more visits to Moscow than he's made to any other country since he's been president. He calls Vladimir Putin his best friend. I mean, they seem like the relationship between Russia and China has been growing a lot ever since President Trump became president of the United States. So do you think that relationship between Russia and China poses a threat? Do you think that it's something that is going to remain stronger than either of their relationships with the United States? Or do you think that it's something that's just a flash in the pan thing that's going to go away as soon as the United States and China can come to some agreement with these tariffs?
Yeah, so first I'd like to talk, like, when you mentioned Trump's isolationist America First policy. I think that's one of his biggest problems in understanding what America First actually means. If you're trying to put the overall well-being and welfare of the American citizens first, you have to understand that the world's really interconnected today, and you can't simply just siphon off America from the rest of the world and expect it to do okay. We need other countries around the world for our own well-being, and that's why this is so important. That's why we need to maintain relations with these countries, not cut off relations with them. And yeah, right now, I think Russia and China are one of, like, the biggest coalitions in the international arena, particularly because, like you said, China and Russia have been partnering a lot on the Belt and Road Initiative. So, like, the Belt and Road Initiative is China's global infrastructure project around Europe, the Middle East, Asia, Africa, South America. They built over 700 projects in infrastructure all around the world. And among these agreements, Russia is the second, like, most listed one in terms of funding and in terms of building. They've been listed 18 times among these projects, which is more than any other country except for China, of course. They've also been really buddy-buddy in terms of lending and money. China has already given a $9.6 billion loan to Russia for separate infrastructure projects and other ventures in the international arena, but I don't think necessarily that this is a relationship that's going to last permanently. I think this is just a virtue of the balance of powers. America has clearly been the biggest power after the Cold War and has been continuing to be, like, the biggest power in the international arena up to this point, and that's why Russia and China are teaming up simply out of competition and simply out of balance of power. I don't think it's necessarily going to last as China rises, and the balance of power might change, where Russia might go off by itself or even partner with America, but I don't think it's necessarily a relationship that's going to last permanently and forever.
Okay, so beyond beyond the relationship between Russia and China and how they relate to each other, there is also obviously some dynamic of how they relate to the United States, but moreover how the American citizens view them and how they view them as threats and so on and so forth. And we've seen a lot of fear about Russia. That kind of started when people thought that Russia intervened with the election, and it's kind of been building ever since. People are saying that, the relationship between Putin and Trump is threatening the country. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of stomach for Americans to be worried about China anymore. And we were really worried about China 5-10 years ago. We were horrified of China, especially with their economic growth, but now we aren't. And I think, like, the epitome of that shift of common enemy kind of came when the second Democratic debate was on, and the moderators asked a question about China becoming a world power and how to handle that threat. And almost every candidate on the stage unanimously rewrote the question and said, I don't think that China's a problem, I think that Russia's the problem. So that being said, why aren't Americans worried about China when obviously they're growing economically? They are having an increased rate of influence in other Asian countries and even Russia and Europe itself. Why aren't Americans worried, and why should they be?
So I think the biggest reason why people are considering Russia greater than China is that you can't really see the threat that China's posing. It's not as tangible as Russia's interference of our elections are. But I also think that's why China's a way bigger threat than Russia. With the Russians' interference of our elections, that's something that we can solve if Congress just decided to actually cooperate on something with an election interference law. And if we had a different Trump that wasn't colluding with Russia or had as good relations with Russia outside of formal diplomatic relations. in order to deal with China, you need an ongoing entire foreign policy shift over time, which would require a lot more resources, a lot more like legislation, a lot more diplomatic ties that would require a lot of things over time, not something you can simply sign away and deal with Russia as it is right now. The biggest problem, I think, is also lack of education in terms of what China is doing around the world. A lot of people just understand that China has just been growing economically. They don't understand much beyond that. But once you press the issues, you realize that China is connected to a lot of the issues here in America. I mean, like, one of the biggest indicators of a president is going to get reelected is how the economy is doing. And if the economy is doing well, then he's going to get reelected. If it's not doing well, he might not get reelected. And I think China has a lot to do with that, especially as we're so connected directly, but also indirectly with the countries that China's making infrastructure projects and pushing into debt also sort of affects their ability to conduct trade with us. If China's exerting their influence on these other countries and not letting them have the resources they typically have to trade with America, that means America's economy is not going to benefit as much in terms of trade with those countries.
And I have another question for you, because I just like listening to you talk. So I've read a lot of op-eds about the rise of China as a power and as, as an economic power. And I've read quite a few that have said, like, it's kind of inevitable that China's going to pass the United States up in terms of, like, economic prowess. I mean, just seeing as they have, like, over 1 billion people that live in China alone, and the United States is hovering around 400 million. So seeing as China doesn't really have the same caliber of soft power that the United States does this economic growth pose an actual threat to the United States as a hegemony, or is it just something that's natural, seeing as there's so many people that live in China, there's so many businesses located there's so much, opportunity for organic economic growth?
Yeah, so I think China rising as an economic power isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's the way that they're doing it. And I think that's something, the bad part or the evil part of the way that they're growing economically is something that the United States can combat with policy. They might not be able to combat natural and organic economic growth in terms of their population and in terms of their natural wealth, but I think the way that they're doing it is something that we can definitely stop with our soft power. I mean, especially in terms of Europe and the United States, one of the biggest concerns that's been growing is climate change. And a lot of that has been doing with fossil fuels and reducing the amount of fossil fuels we use. And meanwhile, while this is happening, China has been building so many oil pipelines, so many gas fields, so many coal-fueled power plants around the world, and that's just contributing to the problem even more. And I think that's partially what we need to be using is our soft power to push towards greenhouse gases and more efficient and more clean uses of fuel, so that in that terms we're combating climate change. I also think we need to be more careful about how our ethical guidelines in terms of lending and how China's conducting their lending, especially when you have a country that's basically committing a genocide on an entire population with the Uyghurs and doesn't necessarily have the best track record with the human rights. They're also exporting that into other countries, like in South America when they're exporting their surveillance software to turn other countries into surveillance states so they can oppress other people. We need to use our soft power. We need to use our trade policies to better enact that, make sure that the trade deals that we're doing and the soft power that we're exerting is pushing against that, and that it's more in the spirit of free trade and more the spirit of economic growth than it is in the spirit of oppression and human rights violations.
Okay, so you've mentioned human rights violations several times, and I've heard you talk about them before, like stuff that I didn't even know was going on in the regions that China was exerting its dominance over. So can you explain some of that? Because I think that's something that's very obviously it relates to us as human beings, and it kind of makes us more inclined to take issue with what's going on in China and what they're doing to other countries. And honestly, a lot of people are not aware of what's going on there. So can you just explain some of those examples?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest mistakes the United States has been doing is just been simply cutting off trade with countries that we don't agree with. I think the way to change a country's views and the way to change a country's culture is not necessarily by cutting off trade with them, but instead by maintaining trade relations with them, because that's how you change a way a person thinks, right? And how a country thinks. You have to continuously interact with them, continuously trade with them until they become not necessarily more like you, but more understanding of the ethical guidelines that the international community as a whole has agreed in. But what's been happening is whatever country we disagree with and we leave, China has just been sucking up. So like a lot of the human rights violations occurring in Malaysia and Burma, China has simply just been coming in instead of in America's stead and giving them loans. And that imposes a couple of problems. First of all, it's reinforcing the human rights violations that they're posing, that they're currently undertaking. But it also simply puts them within China's block. It basically only allows China to have influence over what they're doing and the type of trade that they're conducting and the type of policies they're enacting at home, simply just making America another enemy.
Okay, so you mentioned that we have to stay engaged and trade with these countries in order to wean them off of China and also facilitate some sort of growth towards a more democratic way of governing and less human rights abuses. But how do we do that when these countries are so dependent on China? And how do we do that without abusing the United States' role as an international power?
Yeah, so the thing is, a lot of these countries don't want to be dependent on China because the way that China funds these infrastructure projects is pretty abusive. The interest rates that they're charging on these loans are twice the average interest rate that's recommended by the World Bank. The loans that they're giving are way too high, and they know that the governments can't pay them back, yet they give them anyway, simply because China can exert more influence over them. Like, multiple presidents of these countries and multiple leaders of these countries have asked for funding elsewhere and denounced China's funding, but they have to keep taking it because they don't have funding elsewhere, which is why I think it's especially important for the United States to play a bigger role in it without becoming abusive themselves. It's one thing to do what China's doing and basically take over these countries, and it's another thing to simply facilitate trade via foreign aid. So I think one policy recommendation is something that Trump has actually done well within his office, and that's just to give more funding to the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, which is an agency of the United States government, which facilitates a lot of these infrastructure projects and foreign aid that we give to other countries. I believe it's called the BUILD Act that was passed by Congress and approved by Trump, which will basically combine that agency with USAID's Development Credit Authority, and that will give it an additional $5.5 billion in spending and credit for loans, which really does give America an extra power and boost to actually combat China within these offerings of loans and within money, so that we actually have the resources to combat them effectively. So I think we can simply just use OPIC and the additional funding that it's gotten by investing in those countries and by giving them loans at better interest rates on infrastructure products that won't harm the environment, that will actually benefit both countries, and will actually push them towards leaving China in terms of their sphere of influence, and not necessarily become entirely dependent on the United States, but instead just become...
Yeah, so Americans should absolutely be more worried about what's going on in China and what's going on with their endeavors into other countries and how they're handling that, because I think that arguably poses a large threat to the balance of power around the world and everything that's going on, and our kind of reluctance to see China as a threat in regards to the international community and only see China as a threat when it comes down to intellectual property and business is ultimately something that's going to hurt us in the long run as we continue to turn a blind eye to these violations. But with that being said, I think that pretty much sums up everything that we wanted to hit on this episode. So that concludes this episode of Idiot Soup. So goodbye. You're supposed to say goodbye, but whatever.
Thank you for listening to Idiot Soup Podcast.
You can find us online at idiotsouppodcast.com, on Instagram at Idiot Soup Podcast, on Twitter at Idiot Soup Pod, and also on Facebook, Idiot Soup Podcast, a political podcast. You can listen to future podcast episodes on YouTube, iTunes, Google Podcasts, Podbean, Spotify, Stitcher, and many more platforms. You can find all of those platforms out on our website, and feel free to contact us. So, goodbye.
Goodbye.